Hey everybody, this is our second video in our Israeli Politics for Dummies series, A History of Israeli Politics, 1949 to present. The State of Israel has only existed since 1948, but since then it has managed to see some dramatic changes. In this video we'll go over some of the major events, trends, and themes that have shaped Israeli politics over the past 67 years. First, here are some basic facts. Israel was founded in 1948, and its parliament, the Knesset, was founded in 1949. There have been 20 elections for the Israeli parliament from 1949 to the most recent one, which was in 2015. The Knesset is fixed at 120 seats, and those seats are divided up amongst party lists that run nationwide. They are not divided up by district or region. As we've seen in previous videos in this series, Israel has a large number of parties. The parliament generally has about 10 to 15 parties, with many more that run in elections but fail to win any seats. In the elections for the 20th Knesset in 2015, 10 party lists won seats. Governing coalitions are built from these different parties, creating a government with a minimum of 61 seats. In Israel's 67 years, only 3 parties have ever won the premiership and headed governments: Labor, Likud, and the Kadima party. So the first question is, what drives Israeli politics? Well, the primary dynamics in Israel are similar to those in the US. Politics tend to revolve around demographic groups and interest in certain key issues. As issues change, and as Israel has changed demographically, the paradigm of Israeli politics has shifted dramatically. While the Labour Party dominated Israeli politics for the country's first 3 decades, it went into decline beginning in the late 1970s as the popularity of its socialist economic policies waned and the issue of the future of the West Bank and settlements became a top issue. The history of Israeli politics can be roughly broken down into 3 periods. The first period from 1949 to 1977 is what we call the Unipolar period. It's the early state period when the Labour Party was dominant. The second period, 1977 to 2005, is what we call the bipolar period. It was the end of the Labour monopoly when Likud was ascendant. It's what we also call the two-party period. From 2005 to present is the period of the third parties, when large third parties like Kadima, Yesh Atid, and Kulanu managed to make large gains. It's what we call the multipolar period. There were 2 major events that divided up these 3 periods of time. 1977, the election of Menachem Begin, the first time the Likud came to power, and 2005, when Prime Minister Sharon bolted the Likud to form Kadima and became the first non-Labour or Likud Prime Minister in Israel. In the early years of the state, the Labour Party formed every government and held the premiership from 1949 until 1977. No other party came even close to challenging it. This is therefore considered a unipolar period in Israeli politics, as there was only one political superpower, around which all the other parties aligned. During this period, Labour's influence was not only broad but deep. Israel was largely socialist at the time, with government ownership over major companies involved in transportation, production, media, as well as healthcare and higher education. Labor unions were powerful and centralized by the Histadrut, a labor federation. In Israel's early years, access to jobs, as well as quality education and healthcare, was often dependent on a person's political affiliation. Card-carrying members of the Labour Party were given privileged jobs and a variety of perks. Members of opposition parties were barred from many occupations. Many academics were even forced out of the country to look for work elsewhere due to their political affiliations. This included people like Ben-Gurion Netanyahu, the father of Israel's current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. The Labour Party was boosted in part by its demographic dominance of its core constituency. Secular Ashkenazi Jews, who tended to back the Labour Party, were a solid majority of the country when Israel was founded. In 1948, 80% of Israel's Jewish population was Ashkenazi, meaning Jews who immigrated to Israel from Europe. The vast majority of Israeli Jews also identified as secular at the time. But it wasn't just demographics that helped the Labour Party. The issues of the day created a very different political landscape, one in which Labour thrived. Israel had not yet captured the West Bank, Gaza Strip, or East Jerusalem until 1967. and their final status did not emerge as a major political issue in Israel until a decade later. In the state's early years, the most pressing issues included the question of accepting German reparations to Holocaust survivors, the settlement of Jewish refugees from Europe and Arab countries, the ongoing threats from Israel's Arab neighbors, and how to best respond to terrorism, and the status quo of religion and state. While the Labour Party was clearly left-wing on economic issues and the size of government, it was generally pragmatic on social issues and hawkish on defense. Agreements were struck on the issue of religion and state on favorable terms for the coalition government's religious partners, and the integration of immigrants, while not always successful in practice, was pursued. Early Labour governments responded aggressively to terror attacks and provocations by Arab states, and Labour during this period was relatively hawkish on territory, rebuffing attempts by the United States to force Israel to surrender territory to its Arab neighbors. Even after the 1967 war, the Labour Party remained relatively hawkish on borders and built settlements in the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, parts of the West Bank, and even annexed East Jerusalem. This combination of pro-security positions and socialist economics earned the Labour Party of this period strong support from both the left and center, positioning it to dominate Israeli politics. Okay, the first event we're going to discuss is the 1977 election. After nearly 30 years of dominance, in 1977 the Labour Party lost for the first time in Israeli history. In a stunning turn of events, Likud chief Menachem Begin won a decisive victory and forever changed the landscape of Israeli politics. But how did it happen? A lot of factors went into the rise of Likud and the fall of Labour. First is demographics. While Labour traditionally was stronger amongst secular Ashkenazi Jews, the Likud has been the favorite of Sephardic Jews, those who immigrated to Israel from Arab countries, and also the religious. With waves of Sephardic immigration in the 1950s and 1960s, and the higher birth rate amongst both Sephardic Jews and the Orthodox, the massive demographic edge that Labour held in 1949 was gradually whittled away. Another important factor is the rise of the Likud. Meaning amalgamation in Hebrew, the Likud was born in 1973 out of the unification of a number of smaller right-wing and center-right parties. Individually, these smaller factions never posed a threat to Labour, but the unified Likud did. Thirdly, a large portion of Labour's base had advanced economically since the state's founding. Israel's new middle class no longer embraced Labour's worker-oriented big government socialism, and called for economic and social reforms which cut against the grain of the Labour Party's traditional positions. Also, a number of scandals racked the Labour Party in the 1970s, eroding public trust and fueling the flames of frustration amongst the new Israeli middle class. These scandals highlighted both the corruption and incompetence of leading Labour Party officials, including Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, whose secret illegal bank account reinforced Likud accusations of corruption. Worst of all, however, was the failure of Golda Meir's Labour government at the outset of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Caught unprepared by the Arab attack, the government's response was slow and initially uncoordinated. The hysteria created by the initial attack, and fed by the Labour government's poor performance, tarnished the Labour Party's security credentials. Public confidence in the Labour Party never fully recovered from the blow. When Israelis went to the polls in May 1977, two parties benefited from Labour's collapse. Most obvious is the Likud, which won for the first time. But another party, the Democratic Movement for Change, or DMC, also rose to the fore, gaining an astonishing 15 seats. Made up of a coalition of prominent Israelis from the left, right, and center, the DMC advocated social and political reform, particularly the removal of political power from party bigwigs, favoring the use of party primaries instead. The DMC imploded less than 2 years later, but it presaged the many short-lived, centrist, reform-oriented parties that would arise in following years, appealing to the Israeli middle class, from Shinui to the Center Party to Kadima and Yesh Atid. The 1977 elections marked the beginning of a new era in Israeli politics and society. The Likud's first 2 terms were marked by historic peace negotiations and tumultuous changes both from within and without. Begin signed the first peace treaty with an Arab state in 1979, the Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty. As part of the agreement, Israel surrendered the whole of the disputed Sinai Peninsula, which it had captured in 1967. As part of the withdrawal, in 1982, Israel uprooted about 7,000 Israelis living in settlements built across the vast Sinai Desert. This marked the first forced evacuation of Israelis from their homes in the settlements on a large scale, leading to a notable rift between settlers and their supporters and Israel at large. As Israel negotiated a peace agreement with Egypt, Lebanon's civil war gave the PLO the opportunity to use South Lebanon as a base for large-scale attacks on Israel. As the attacks escalated, Israel intervened in Lebanon twice, first in a limited operation in 1978, and again in 1982 for what would become a decades-long involvement. By the end of the decade, the First Intifada had led to dramatic rises in terrorism across Israel and the territories, polarizing Israeli politics further. After the Likud's victory in 1977, Menachem Begin formed the first non-labor government in Israeli history. 4 years later, however, with the demise of the DMC, labor regained some of its strength, though it would never return to its pre-1977 levels. Thus, the next 28 years remained bipolar in Israeli politics, where two parties, the Likud and Labor, were dominant. Following the 1984 election, the Knesset was very narrowly divided, with the right-wing and religious parties winning by a slender margin of 61 to 59. To create a more stable coalition, the Labor and Likud parties formed a unity government, with Likud head Yitzhak Shamir and Labor chief Shimon Peres serving as rotational prime ministers, 2 years apiece. This arrangement was continued after the next election in 1988, despite the right wing winning a clear majority of 65 to 55. But the bipartisan cooperation that marked the mid and late 1980s didn't last. In 1990, a seminal event in Israeli politics occurred, what has come to be known as the Dirty Trick. After the right won a convincing majority in 1988, Labor head Shimon Peres feared that Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, who was scheduled to step down later that year and rotate with Foreign Minister Peres as part of their unity government agreement, thought that Shamir would renege on the deal and drop Labor for a narrow right-wing coalition. Peres used the pretext of Shamir's refusal to negotiate with exiled PLO members, as had been suggested by the first Bush administration, as a pretext to leave the coalition. Peres and the Labor Party bolted the government and convinced two of the three ultra-Orthodox parties to follow, threatening to topple Shamir's government. With partial ultra-Orthodox backing, a vote of no confidence was passed, bringing down the government, the first time in Israeli history. Before Peres could assemble a new coalition, however, last-minute public appeals by two leading ultra-Orthodox rabbis convinced the ultra-Orthodox parties to withdraw their endorsement of Peres and return to the Shamir government. Shamir's new government, however, was far smaller and thus heavily dependent on all members, forcing Shamir to make heavy concessions to even minor coalition partners. The aftermath of the Dirty Trick. While the whole affair lasted only about 3 months, it reshaped Israeli politics for years. Here are some of the more noteworthy effects. Number 1. It brought to an end cooperation between Likud and Labor. Number 2. It highlighted growing polarization of the right and left. Number 3. Ultra-Orthodox involvement in it stirred tensions between the religious and secular, and led to greater involvement by anti-clerical parties. And lastly, frustration with demands by smaller parties and the vulnerability of coalitions led to major political reforms, including the direct election of prime ministers. Israeli politics in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Israeli politics underwent 6 major changes. Number 1. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, a huge wave of immigration from Warsaw Pact countries radically changed Israel demographically and politically. Ex-Soviet immigrants were initially a swing vote in Israel, but by the late 1990s had become reliably right-wing as a whole. Number 2. Pressure from the American government on Israel began to have a strong direct impact on Israeli politics, at times helping to decide the outcome of elections. Number 3. Economic reforms stabilizing Israel's currency and shrinking the size of government helped to create a prosperous middle class. That middle class was less strongly partisan than the rest of Israel, favoring capitalistic economic policies and a pragmatic policy towards the territories and security issues. Number 4. After the Dirty Trick, demand for electoral reform led to the direct election system. Used in 1996, 1999, and 2001, direct elections for the Prime Minister allowed Israelis to vote directly for one of 2 candidates for Prime Minister, while voting separately for the Knesset. This accelerated the growth of small parties and the decline of both Labor and the Likud, which by the end of the decade had shrunk from an average of more than 40 seats apiece in the 1980s to about 20 seats apiece in the 1990s. 5. Ethnic parties. Ethnic parties had always existed in Israel, but became a major force in the 1990s, peaking at about 34 seats out of 120 in 1999. Number 6. The Oslo process. Beginning with the Oslo Agreement signed by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat in 1993, the Oslo process became the defining political issue of the 1990s. The agreement, which created the Palestinian Authority and allowed PLO exiles to return and govern in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, was extremely controversial and sparked off massive protests, a first large wave of Arab suicide bombings, and the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin by a Jewish opponent of Oslo. By the end of 1995, Israel was more polarized than ever before. Okay, we've come to the last era in Israeli politics, 2005 to present. Here's some background on what's called the era of the third parties. The decline and fall of labor. In the fall of 2000, the second intifada, far more violent than the first, was launched by Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Unable to curb the violence, incumbent Labour Prime Minister Ehud Barak lost in a landslide election to Likud's Ariel Sharon in 2001. 2001 was the last time that direct elections for the Prime Minister were used. Hoping to restore strength to Israel's two largest parties, the Knesset ended the direct election system in 2002. Since 1999, the Labour Party has never won the premiership. The Israeli left, already in decline, was severely weakened by the Second Intifada, as Israeli voters shifted to the right. In 2003, in the midst of the Intifada, the Labour Party sank to 19 seats, while Likud won twice as many, a full 38 seats. Many Labour voters ditched the party in favor of the more centrist Shinui party. Strongly capitalistic but relatively dovish on the territories, Shinui advocated religious reforms and the reduction of the welfare state, a platform that appealed to secular upper-middle-class voters, earning the party a whopping 15 seats in 2003. Shinui's rise helped to split the dovish vote and marked the decline of the left and accompanying rise of the center, presaging the success of Kadima 3 years later. In 2005, Sharon evacuated all Israeli settlements and army units out of the Gaza Strip and northern West Bank. The operation split the country and broke the Likud into two. Following his controversial Gaza disengagement in the summer of 2005, Ariel Sharon left the Likud to found a new radical centrist party, Kadima. Drawing members from the Likud, Labour, and several smaller parties, Kadima easily won the 2006 election, winning 29 seats. Much like earlier centrist parties like the Third Way, the Center Party, and Shinui Party, Kadima favored territorial compromise, the foundation of a Palestinian state on most of the West Bank, but is more capitalistic than the Israeli left. Former Jerusalem Mayor Ehud Olmert led Kadima in 2006, following a series of strokes that left Prime Minister Sharon incapacitated. Olmert's poor handling of the 2006 summer war with Hezbollah and the Hamas takeover of Gaza, along with a series of corruption scandals, led to Olmert's resignation and brought the Likud back to power in 2009. With most of the electorate divided between the Likud and Kadima, Labour won a paltry 13 seats under former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, the fewest ever in its history. In 2011, Labour hit rock bottom, splitting into two, with Barak founding a new centrist party, Independence. In 2013, the Kadima party collapsed, dropping from 28 to only 2 seats, barely making it into the Knesset. The Likud maintained power, forming a government with the new centrist party, Yesh Atid. Founded by Shinui chief Tommy Lapid's son, Yair Lapid, Yesh Atid emphasizes secularization, reforming and limiting the welfare state, and an end to religious exemptions from the draft. In 2013, the party won a stunning 19 seats. In 2015, however, the party lost much of its strength, falling to 11 seats, while another centrist party, Kulanu, won 10. Formed by ex-Likud minister Moshe Kahlon, Kulanu is a slightly more populist centrist party. Now that we've gone over some of the major events in the history of Israeli politics, let's sum up some of the major themes and trends. One of the most obvious trends in Israeli politics has been the decline of the left. The Israeli left, which was once dominant in Israeli politics, has shrunk to a marginal player. Averaging during the first period 61 seats, it sank to 46 during the second period, and since the year 2000 has only averaged 25 seats in every Knesset. The flip side of the decline of the Israeli left has been the rise of the Israeli right. In the first period during Israeli politics, right-wing and religious parties won a mere 47 seats on average. That rose to 60 seats during the second period, and from the year 2000 on, they've won an average of 62 seats per Knesset, a majority. The most recent trends in Israeli politics have been the rise of Jewish ethnic factionalism in the 1980s and 1990s, and the phenomenon of floating voters. While there have always been parties representing specific ethnic groups in Israel, they've become a major force in Israeli politics only in the 1980s and 1990s, with groups like Sephardic Jews and immigrants from the ex-USSR most commonly the focus of such parties. Centrist parties, on the other hand, were formerly a negligible factor, but rose to prominence as the phenomenon of the floating voter became more common. Floating voters are primarily middle-class non-Orthodox voters who lack strong ties to any party or specific ideology. They're generally capitalistic, reform-oriented, concerned about security, but also flexible on the future of the territories. They fueled the rise of Shinui in 2003, Kadima in 2006 and 2009, Yesh Atid in 2013, and Kulanu in 2015. But since these voters are so elastic, their support for a party rarely lasts more than 1 or 2 elections, leading to a high turnover rate among center parties. That's all we have for today. If you like this video and want to learn more, check out our website at dcandjerusalem.com.